I'm the community manager for the Julia programming language. I've been in this role now since the beginning of 2020, which feels like when I say it out loud, it seems like a short time ago, but from actual life, it feels like it was years ago now. So yeah, I've been in this role now for almost 2 years, and then outside of that, I'm also on the board of directors of Num Focus, which is, if folks aren't familiar, it's a nonprofit U.S. entity that helps sort of facilitate some of the legal and administrative stuff for a lot of popular scientific computing ecosystems like Jupyter, SciPy, Julia, lots of other cool things.
That is amazing, and like I didn't know about that in your background as well. You go deep in the open source world, at least in the side of the scientific side that I don't go very deep in. So I'm actually really excited to learn a bit about this space. And speaking of space, do you want to talk about your background and how you got into the Julia language?
Yeah, sure. So I sort of I think probably like most great things in life, I sort of just stumbled into it. I was fortunate enough to get an internship at NASA, and it just so happened that the team that I joined at NASA was using Julia to do a bunch of really interesting. They were actually planning the traverses for lunar rovers, and it was a really interesting problem because prior to using this software that the team that I was on wrote, they used to literally just get a bunch of experts in a room and they'd like draw it out on a whiteboard and they'd be like, okay, this looks good. Like we could probably do this, but as you can imagine, that's sort of a suboptimal way of solving the problem. So we built this really cool piece of software to help make better traverses for lunar rovers, and ultimately just started making open source contributions out of sort of a necessity because at the time Julia wasn't in the 1.0, hadn't hit the 1.0 release yet. So there's a lot of bugs, a lot of questions, and ultimately became more involved in the community through Google's Codin project, and then ultimately as the community manager.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, that's a great story, and I think so I spent some time, and I know you saw me on TikTok live earlier this week. I spent some time on TikTok, and I've been doing a lot of videos around getting started in programming and open source. And what I love about this is that everybody starts differently. Like, there's no real clear cut path to get involved in projects and communities, but sometimes you just you just gotta jump in there. You gotta start, and we'll get into that a bit with the Julia language towards the end, but can you give us like an overview on Julia itself and like what can people expect to do with it?
Yeah, totally. So Julia is a general purpose programming language. Pretty much anything that you can do with another programming language, you could also do with Julia. The sort of enticing reason that you may want to use Julia, one of many, and sort of the real selling feature probably depends on who you are as a developer and what sort of the pain points that you have are. But in general, the sort of high level tagline is that Julia solves the two language problem. And if folks aren't familiar with the two language problem, it's generally that you have really high level flexible languages like Python, and then you have sort of less flexible lower level languages like C++ or C. And obviously in C++ and C, it's a little bit more difficult to write elegant code, but it's really fast. Python, easy to write elegant code, or easier to write elegant code,
Yeah.
but it's a little bit slower. So Julia sort of comes in and gives you that high level syntax that's easy to use, but it's also as fast as C++ or C, which again makes it so that you don't have to write your prototype code in Python. And then when you want to go to a production environment, rewrite all of your code in C++ or C.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense too as well. So are we talking that I see behind here the LLVM is Julia based on C? Like how is it derived?
Yeah, so I think there's some C sort of underpinnings, and if you look at the actual GitHub repo, the language is written in Julia itself, which is again one of the really cool things. It's not a sort of wrapper on top of C++ or something like that. There's definitely at some point you have to make C calls,
Yeah.
so that is part of it, but it is a just ahead of time compiled language.
Okay. Excellent. And I believe like Python is written in Python to an extent, And I think there's a interesting correlation in how people develop these languages. The sort of the base layer um, gets set up, and I'll probably just stumble through this and not explain this quite like correctly. But I do have some experience working on some low level JavaScript stuff, and usually when C++ starts appearing, that's where I sort of like take a step back and like this is not above my pay grade. I'll let the smart people touch this stuff.
I'm in the same boat as you, honestly. Anytime I see C++ stuff, I'm like, I want to avoid null pointer exceptions and anything with pointers. So I'm just going to stay as far away as I can.
Cool, cool. But yeah, so I'm curious to learn more about the use cases for Julia Lang and what people can expect because you say it solves a couple problems, but like what are the problems that it excels in?
Yeah, that's another good question. I think what you predominantly see Julia being used for right now is things where performance becomes the bottleneck. Obviously, Julia has a bunch of really nice features that, in general, make it a positive programming experience. But if you're sort of building like a Hello World app, that versus the Hello World app in Python, obviously speed doesn't matter to you. So really, it's the folks who are using Julia extensively are folks who have been using one of these other tools, Python, MATLAB, what have you, and have sort of reached the fundamental barrier as far as what is computationally possible with those languages. So you see this in like really large scale settings. Like one example of this is the Klima project out of Caltech. And that Klima project, the goal for this project is to build simulations of the environment, both the atmosphere and the oceans, climate simulations, and build those on the scale of the entire planet. And you can imagine already, if folks are familiar with just simulating anything, it's really difficult. If you try to simulate like a water droplet in a cup, it's very difficult to do. There's tons of computation that's involved. So you can imagine if you try to simulate the entire Earth, very challenging problem. And those folks chose to use Julia because of the sort of high level syntax, because of the speed, all those sort of things coming together.
Okay, excellent. And then when I think about like these large data sets, that where speed really matters, if you have to go and compute through all those things, do you have some examples of folks using Julia in, I guess, quote unquote production or in science rather?
Yeah. So the Klima project is one of those. Another one that I think is really interesting is the Pumas project. So Pumas.ai is the website for that one. And their goal is sort of twofold. One of the aspects of it is that they're trying to develop sort of accelerated pharmaceutical models. And this enables a bunch of really interesting things, one of which is the Pumas team is actually involved in the development of the Pfizer and Moderna COVID vaccine. And those organizations were both using this Pumas.ai tool written in 100% Julia to help accelerate the discovery of new drugs and vaccines, which is super interesting. And I think there's a quote somewhere, and it might be on the Julia computing website that you have open, or on the Pumas website, but something on the order of, I think it was like 10,000x improvement in speed that the Pumas team helped. I forgot whether it was Pfizer or Moderna achieve in their simulation process. And you can imagine, sort of in the context that we're all living in right now, a global pandemic, that 10,000x improvement in speed is the difference between a simulation taking, 30 minutes and a simulation taking a week. And, the difference in the 30 minutes in the week is people's literal lives being saved. So I think this, again, is one of the most compelling things for me to see the speed improvements in production.
Yeah, that is amazing to hear it too as well. And again, this is an entire world when it comes to open source and research. I just don't have a good handle on because I tend to talk about making boxes purple and doing front end UI components. But I love that this is a space where folks can really engage and join this community and help solve some of these problems either directly or tangentially. I think there's like just recently, so we did the Mars rover now runs up on well on Mars, and we did this thing on GitHub where we sort of engaged and like celebrated all the Python projects that and were embedded on the rover to make that work. And I think we could do a lot of this with like these other things, like just the pandemic alone, being able to highlight all this open source developer work. That's one, and I think this is the number we're looking for: 175x faster using GPUs in Julia. Absolutely mind-boggling.
Yeah, it is. It's crazy. And I think there's such a sort of worldwide community, sort of independent of the work that Pumas is doing right at the beginning of the pandemic. Lots of really interesting work about how Julia was being used to model the different outbreaks of COVID as well. There was actually a class at MIT that was being taught by the folks who created Julia. And they were sort of using Julia to do this simulation and teaching folks how they could do it as well if they wanted to help sort of model the outbreak of COVID in their local area. So very interesting stuff.
Yeah. And just wanted to also point out, folks who are here live on chat, I do have the chat open. So if you're involved in sort of open source or any sort of scientific programming, feel free to drop links or examples of different projects that are leveraging open source to solve some of these global reach or even maybe local reach problems. I would love to just have a list of that in my head.
Someone's mentioning that the rover badge is the best badge, and yes, I have that NP2. I didn't contribute to the rover badge, which I feel bad about, but maybe they'll make some for the moon rovers, and I can get that badge.
Yeah, and you seem to be close, like with the Numb Focus group too as well. You seem close to the source. So like if folks, I imagine that everybody's probably having serious conversations and proceeding with getting the open source world and scientific research moving forward. But you could also get maybe some insight on the next badge in that conversation as well.
Yeah, my fingers are crossed. I think, as you mentioned, there's so many cool opportunities for badges, and I think it's one of the fun, cool little things that open source developers get for oftentimes, lots of free labor. So
yeah, and I will. I have a person in mind who just had the badge, but I can't remember his handle. So we'll y'all just have to believe me for what. Actually, Google Mars rover badge if you haven't seen it yet, and you'll find that as well. So talking about Julia, I'm curious, how can folks get involved, or if people wanted to try this maybe on a small little sandbox project to get up to speed, how do people sort of start?
Yeah, so on the Julia website, there's a learning tab, and under that learning tab, we sort of have things set up to hopefully help whatever kind of learner you are. So if you're like, hey, like I really like classroom environments where someone is sort of lecturing and I can follow along, we have that through Julia Academy, and that's just again sort of curated courses built by Julia developers that are free to the world. If you're like, I just want to get my hands dirty, start solving problems, run into issues, whatever that is, that approach, you can learn Julia on this platform called exorcism.io. And it's a bit of a weird name, but it's such a cool platform. Basically, you can go on here, you can solve real Julia problems, and then you can submit your solutions to a group of mentors, and the mentors will actually review them and say, hey, here's actually how you can write better Julia code. And it's completely free. And I'll also note that it's not just Julia on this platform. There's a ton of other languages that are supported. So I think this is one of the coolest ways that you can go and learn any new
I'll
language.
also say that Exorcism, created by GitHub employee Katrina Owen as well. It's actually how I learned how to write Go, is through Exorcism as well.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. Great shout out.
GitHub employees doing lots of cool stuff.
Yeah. I guess she did create that before she joined GitHub, but yeah, she did do a tour at GitHub as well. But yeah, it's super cool. And then I see there's some YouTube links to the official Julia YouTube as well.
Lots of fun videos on the Julia YouTube. I think the annual Julia conference that happens every year is called JuliaCon, and JuliaCon is an incredible way to sort of get a pulse on all the interesting things that the Julia community is doing. And I'm admittedly behind on watching all the videos because lots of organizing work that had to be done. So I oftentimes don't get to see as many of the videos as folks. But every year, absolutely blown away with the growth that the community is seeing, and you can see it in the number of videos and views and all that stuff that come to these JuliaCon videos, and also the breadth of what people are using Julia for. It's absolutely incredible. So there's a few playlists on here, and you can also go to juliacon.org and see some of the talks and things like that. But lots of incredible use cases for Julia.
Okay, cool. And I realized we jumped right in as well. But what's the story behind the Julia name for the language?
Yeah, another good question. The short story is that there's no good story.
That's the best.
I think one of the yeah, that's the best answer. One of the co-creators had a sample project that he was working on prior to this version of Julia that you see, and it was called Julia. And then eventually, when all the co-creators of Julia came together and started building the language, they're like, we need a name. And Jeff Bezanson is the guy's name. Jeff was like, hey, I have this other name that we used, and they just ended up using it. So there's no good story, but still a cool name. And I think the t-shirts look good, and yeah.
Yeah, I love that logo too as well. They brought in the color, but also it's a fun logo too as well. Definitely, that's a memorable one.
Yeah, the three dots as well. It just goes really well. And for images that you have to use when there's a circular icon, the three dots just fit right in. It's perfect.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I'm kind of amazed and surprised that I have like almost zero context coming to this conversation about Julia, but now I'm excited to actually start watching some of this content and seeing if I can start tinkering around with some large data sets and maybe get my introduction to ML with some Julia as well.
Yeah, I think machine learning and data science machine learning, data science, and then just science in general are sort of the three areas where we're seeing Julia really get pushed forward. I think in the machine learning space, I think Julia as a language and any new sort of framework that's coming out is going to have challenges just because of how well established frameworks like PyTorch, TensorFlow, Keras, they're monsters, they're behemoths. They have full-time groups of people building content, building new features. So it's really difficult to sort of quote unquote compete against those organizations, which is why I think in the sort of more general science domain, where there isn't as much sort of institutional corporate backing, that's where you see a lot of the growth happening for Julia. People who are biologists, people who are physicists, and there's no corporation that's sort of pushing packages or ecosystems. People are just building stuff in Julia because it's faster, it makes sense to them, it's easy to use, and that's where again a lot of the interesting and compelling use cases are as well.
Yeah, and what I like about that too as well, because it like there's some crossover with education and research, but it's like an open source is like this punk rock element where you just kind of you're not going against the grain, but you're kind of just moving along the beat of your own drum. So you just sort of try things out. It doesn't have to be constrained to the forces that make everything work behind the scenes. And it's nice to hear that with Julia that exists as well. I did want to take a step back and actually talk more about your involvement in the language itself, like what the role you play, because you mentioned the organization and the conferences. So like, what's the title you hold within the Julia community, and like what are the things that, because I do want to sort of elevate some of like even your non-code contributions in the community and how valuable that is.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think so. My title is community manager. That may be sort of a misleading title in a lot of cases because what I do is put out fires, solve problems, help really identify and fill the gaps that exist in large open source projects. And for me, it's the Julia project, but help identify the gaps that exist in the community and the ecosystem and fill those gaps. And again, for folks who maybe are just getting started with open source, the reason for why those gaps exist is because in open source, you have a bunch of people who are oftentimes, either focused on their thing, like they really like this package or specific ecosystem. They're really into biology, and they've built this really cool thing in the biology domain using Julia, but it's sort of maybe it's not super interconnected with the rest of the ecosystem, the community. There's sort of these missing links between everything, and what I'm trying to do is find those things, make sure everything is connected in the way that it needs to be, and also again do the work that maintainers often don't have the bandwidth to do. Again, people who are maintaining open source software, as you know, Brian, people are doing it. They're doing it because they enjoy it, and also maybe because they need that tool for their day job, but they don't have infinite amount of time to, be a developer advocate, be a community manager, write content, all those things. So helping identify those gaps as well, and try to fill those when I have the skill set to actually do that.
Yeah, the one thing I know from having these conversations on Fridays, but also having other conversations with maintainers, is a lot of folks they get into open source because they love the problem they're solving, but very quickly once you get adoption, so like once Julia goes from like 1 star to 2 stars, and someone else downloads it and leverages it in whatever problem, you quickly become the product manager, the program manager, the advocate, the marketer of the actual GitHub repository. And folks like you who come in and help support some of those other skill set gets those folks, as you mentioned, back in the driver's seat of being able to ship code. And the beauty of that is like not that one day you're going to become a core contributor, maintainer on the project, but a lot of times if folks, if that's your interest, you do get free mentorship by being close to the source, having the conversation, sitting in the meetings. And if that's what your goal is, like just like any apprentice, if you look at any apprentice in history or just in any woodworking or metalworking or science, you have to like learn the ropes by going to the meetings and taking notes and helping out in places that need help. And I think it's an under realized position, community management. As you mentioned, like it's your description is broader than just community management, but you basically get to catch up and grab stuff that before it hits the floor, basically. So I appreciate you sharing, coming on, chatting with us, and giving some of that context. If folks want to get involved in the Julia community, like what's a good first step?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think for me, and maybe this is a bad take, but I think people, if you have free time and you're like, I just want to explore cool things, I think figuring out what the use case is that's most sort of inspirational, motivational, or what have you, because I think like learning anything new, if you don't have sort of a reason that you want to do it, it's sort of you're going to go on, maybe check it out for a few minutes, and then be like, okay, I don't need another thing in my life that I have to spend my time doing. So I think finding, again, what is it that's specifically interesting to you? Is it machine learning? Is it some field of the biological sciences, what have you? Find that field and then go and see what the interesting stuff that people in the Julia community are doing in that field. And then from there, checking out the learning resources, checking out all the different ways to contribute. We have a ongoing process of sort of building some really nice contributing guidelines that are sort of more broad to the open source / Julia community. So I can point folks, I think it's just julialang.org/contribute, but I'll note that it's a big work in progress. We have a technical writer through Google Season of Docs who is working on that, which is awesome. So I think that's what I would suggest folks do.
Yeah, I'd actually reach out to that organization too as well, because I love that Season of Docs. I love that, and I love that folks are being able to contribute and get involved in open source in different means and manners as well. So I just wanted to say thank you so much, Logan, for coming and chatting with us. Conversation is now winding down. Folks, Logan's GitHub handle is just below in the lower third of his screen, as well as my GitHub handle, and actually this is my Twitch name, because it's not been updated. But feel free to follow me. Follow the GitHub channel if you like these conversations. If you have any suggestions, reach out. Invite yourself on the show. I'm totally fine to have people invite themselves. We've actually had quite a few maintainers who invited themselves up here. So yeah, super happy to have recommendations. And enjoy the rest of your Open Source Friday, and ship some code.